Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Chautauqua and our Tuesday Talk. I'm Larry Bounds, and I am here to introduce our speaker tonight. A couple of little housekeeping reminders. For one thing, I know I put my cell phone on airplane mode, and if you would do that or turn it off or silence it, that would be wonderful. And I will try my best at the end of the program tonight to remind you and myself to take it off airplane mode, okay? Let's see. Tonight we're going to be exploring the Revolutionary War hero Captain Henry Felder. Not a name that any of us read about when we were reading the history of the Revolution. But as I think you will learn, there was an awful lot of revolutionary history that happened in South Carolina that we never heard about. And that's one of the reasons why we're bringing Captain Felder, who was from the Orangeburg district. That was considered the edge of the frontier, and his fighting, and you'll learn more about that tonight, as well as the other things that were going on in that period. The Greenville Chautauqua always likes to thank the Greenville Library System for allowing us to use this space for the Tuesday Talks. They sponsor us here with the Tuesday Talks. And they have kindly provided on the back wall a series of materials which you are welcome to check out that pertain to what we're talking about tonight. All right? Let's see. Also, if you have not yet signed up for the Chautauqua mailing list, I know just yesterday I received this in the mail. This is the Chautauqua Reader for this year. The Chautauqua Reader has articles such as this one about Captain Henry Felder, where you get a timeline telling all about him, other suggested readings you can have, and his story written over here by the gentleman who's going to be playing him. And there's information about the person playing him this summer down at the bottom. So lots of information, where the shows are, when the shows are for the festival. In fact, we encourage you, pick up several, pass them out to your friends and neighbors, take them to church or to school or wherever, hand them out, let people know about it, to encourage folks to come out. Because friends don't let friends miss Chautauqua. Bet you never heard that before, eh? Okay. Let's see here. Speaking of friends helping friends, there's always a place for you as a volunteer helping out in the Chautauqua show. So if you have an interest in helping to volunteer, that's how I first got started 20-something years ago, was volunteering to help out at the shows, and we encourage everybody who has any interest in that direction to sign up for that as well. Remember, when you do sign up for like the mailing list, for example, we don't sell your name and information to anybody else. It's just within our group. Okay. Our speaker tonight is a native South Carolinian and a direct descendant of the subject of this program tonight, Captain Henry Felder. He is also the author of the South Carolina Militia in the Revolutionary War. I did not buy this one here tonight. I actually already had this one. I bought this one at the Greer History Museum, where if you haven't been, by the way, to the Greer History Museum, it's really quite nice in downtown Greer. So I'll put a little plug in for them as well. But for 15 years, primarily for his own family, he was collecting works about their ancestor, Captain Henry Felder. And then he had written so much and had researched so much that he expanded it to cover the entire backcountry battles of the I keep wanting to say Civil War. It's like so often of the Revolutionary War. It's sort of different not to be talking about the Civil War in South Carolina. Anyway,
That's true.
but he expanded his text to capture the uniqueness of the South Carolina colony and its emergence of a South Carolina militia, a story that is actually somewhat different from any of the other 12 colonies. Our speaker is a retired Air Force officer who holds degrees from both Clemson and Auburn universities. Please welcome tonight's speaker, John Brian Eleazar.
Thank you, Larry. I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction you gave me, Larry. And I want to thank the Chautauqua Talks for inviting me, and Laura and Savannah over there working the headphones, and those who made this, just wonderful. You have a wonderful city here. It's been about a year since I've been here, and it's just such a lovely city. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about my ancestor, Captain Henry Felder of the Orangeburg District. Henry Felder was my sixth great-grandfather, and he would immigrate from Switzerland to Charlestown and then settle in the Orangeburg District in 1735. I was raised in the middle part of this state, but I rapidly transferred to one of my first loves, American history, after I retired from the military. This past May, I was able to finally publish my first book, The South Carolina Militia of the Revolutionary War, and I continue my writings and anything I can do to elevate the visibility of the uniqueness of this state during the Revolutionary War. It's something for us to be proud of. We're going to continue to celebrate the 250th anniversaries, and please remember that's plural because we'll be celebrating this for 7 years because our part comes in later. I am deeply motivated by my family roots. My mother was a Felder and a resident. The Felders have been residents of South Carolina since 1735. And on my father's side, the Eleazars have been residents of South Carolina since 1751. I'm curious, how many today are connected with men and women who were in the Revolutionary War? Do we have many in here today? A few. And I'm sure you're proud of them. I am. Let me see if I can work this. What you see here is my 55-year-plus-old Eleazar ancestor, Johann Stephen Eleazar, supplied the American patriots throughout the war numerous times just above Columbia, South Carolina, in an area called Spring Hill. And that was a very tight loyalist area. So he did it at some risk. And in the bottom right picture is the Eleazar Tavern that's existed since about 1760. It wasn't his to begin with. It was owned by a loyalist. But William Henry Drayton went recruiting to understand the sentiments of the backcountry long before the war. And he, we believe, stopped, according to USC's history department and research I have done, we believe that to be the tavern, which still exists in Spring Hill. And that is a small petition of many we have where he was contributing to the patriots who stopped by for supplies, whether it be a wagon, whether it be horse, be fodder for horses. There was a lot of that throughout the war. And Captain Henry Felder, who we're going to speak to tonight, was an early magistrate of the Orangeburg District. He was an enforcer of the Continental Association boycott of British goods to this colony. He was also a representative of the infancy of the South Carolina government. And then he was the captain of the South Carolina militia, and so was his 7 sons. They would, after the fall of Charlestown, him and his 7 sons would work under our leaders that we knew, General Thomas Sumter, General Francis Marion, Colonel Charles Stark Middleton, and Colonel William Washington. And if you know that name, that's George's second cousin, I believe, who came down here. A real godsend during the Revolutionary War. And by the end of the war, two of these Felders would give their life for this country. An initial payment for the freedoms and the liberties that we enjoy today. I asked that earlier question because many of us like genealogy and American history. We all may have stories about our ancestors coming over here, the travel, the risks they took during the Revolutionary War, proud stories that we need to capture during this time for the generations ahead. Captain Henry Felder is obviously one of my inspirational stories because my mother was a school teacher and she told me the story of my ancestor, Henry Felder, Revolutionary War captain, who fought and was shot fleeing his home that was afire and by British loyalist bullets while he was wearing a dress trying to escape. Now, a young boy does not forget that story. And I think about it that, yeah, there's more here, but I was too young. Life took over for a while, and I ignored the story. But fortunately, my mother kept really good notes of all of our family stories. Being a school teacher, that would be something she would do. I also had a lot of my grandfather's notes that he had captured after he could not do surgery anymore. He started investing in our genealogy. And then I had my own notes. So as Larry said, for the next 15 years or so, I started coming up to speed, collecting everything that I could find on this story. And I found a couple of inescapable facts about Henry Felder. First of all, he could not be reduced to a genealogy of a birth, of a marriage, children, and then death. He was not passive during the growth of this colony. And he was in the middle of the turmoil from the early beginnings. He didn't let grass grow under his feet. And his story is intimately woven into South Carolina's growth, the early government, and the American Revolution. And it's the same story of many South Carolina descendants of men and women that served, suffered, and died or injured during this war. It's a story that is undertold, as Larry suggested. And if it is told, it's minimized to footnotes or short stories or biographies of people we well know, such as Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, Andrew Pickens, the Owl or the Wizard, he went by a couple of names, or Nathaniel Greene, and heroes that we know. But the story of the militia and the men and women that fought it is undertold. And I'm going to cover several main points today, and that is South Carolina was unique. It had differences than all the other colonies in significant ways, and that's how they were able to persevere for 7 years. It is also a story of early engagement, the storming and the norming of the backcountry to work with the prominence of Charlestown. Because at the beginning of the war, if I forget to say it, the backcountry had grants, such as the grant also on the next page, from the royal government. They didn't have a quarrel with Britain. That was Charleston's war. And I'll talk about that. And also it's a story somewhat of a lone resistance of the South Carolina militia during the war for the better part of 1780 to 1781. When Charleston would fall, our militia was the only thing we had here. And we weren't giving up. Let's see if we can go to the next one. So Henry's story began as Johann Heinrich Henry Felder. He was born on March 2nd, 1725, as Hans Heinrich and Ursula Zuber Felder. As I mentioned, he arrived here in 1735, and they were welcomed by the Charleston when they got here. They arrived on the ship, the Samuel, with 250 other Swiss Germans. In the Gazette, on 19 July 1735, they wrote, amongst them are 90 fit to bear arms, and it is not doubted but their setting of this province will be contribute to its strength, and by their industry and laborness tend to its great advantage. And we ask, why did Europeans, or the Swiss German predominantly, come to the Americas, or the Swiss Germans specifically to South Carolina? They did come here for religious freedoms, like most, or to escape the turmoil of tyranny over in Europe at the time. But there was something unique about South Carolina from the beginning. There was an incentive for them to come here. The royal governor, Robert Johnson, had formed the Johnson Plan. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but there was such a fear of the Indians and the French and the Spanish that they came up and devised a plan of 10 settlements across the back country on main roads, main rivers, to insulate or buffer Charleston from the Indians and the encroachments of the French and the Spanish. That was an incentive that everyone knew about, and then they could go after such a grant. There was also advertisement. There was a man named John Peter Purry from Neuchâtel, Switzerland, who was aware of what was going on here, and he wrote a wonderful pamphlet talking about South Carolina in 1731. And this pamphlet went throughout Switzerland, probably the lower part of Germany and probably northern France, but I know it was in Switzerland. I don't know if my ancestors actually saw that pamphlet, but I'm aware of the pamphlet. There was incentives and there were advertisements. Now, what were the conditions in Europe at the time? Well, it wasn't favorable for Swiss Germans, especially young Swiss Germans. There was a lot of class distinction. You were not going to rise beyond your post living in that area. The young men were in trouble because they would be conscripted into mercenaries and taken to foreign wars, likely not to be seen again. And there was also, obviously, the religious freedoms and the conflicts between Protestants and Catholics in Switzerland at that time. And there were a lot of obstacles. The travel cost. It probably cost half a year's pay to book a trip to America. Quite an investment, but that wasn't all. They were required to leave behind money to take care of those that were left behind, because everyone wasn't fit to travel. And then there was also Switzerland. They had lost so many men and women to America that they banned any further travel. They were finally able to secure a waiver. So these 250 men and women went 600 miles down the Rhine River to Rotterdam, which took about 50 or more days. And then they traveled for 9 weeks to get here. Now, the question would be, what do you think they thought of South Carolina when they got here? I think those that are from South Carolina would know what they may have thought, and you know what? You're right. John Peter Purry mentioned in the handbill we had annoying mosquitoes. I don't know if any of y'all know what those are, but they were annoying. And we had this is his words, seldom seen serpents called rattlesnakes. I think I know what those are. And then the ones who were here would write back to the area that they left. And we would know that it was a difficult trip. And it was a difficult and dangerous trip. And they advised no one to undertake this journey unless it was necessary. For on their ship and another, over 200 Swiss people died because of seasickness. And if you got here in the harbor and you were sick, you probably wouldn't be allowed off your boat. And many died there because of poor care. And then the thing that we enjoy here in South Carolina is the heat is very great there. Those who come suffer a great deal. I wouldn't know what they were talking about. But what occurred when Henry got here, and I think he was around 14 at the time, within a few years, his father died and his mother died. And he was an orphan at the age of about 14. He was taken care of by the neighbor that was a good friend of the family. However, Henry immediately started getting engaged. He was engaged in the church. He was engaged sitting in for baptisms. He went before the colony council to advocate for their pastor there, John Greisenheimer, I believe. And then he started acquiring land. He inherited somewhere between 200 to 500 acres. But within short order in 1751, he started accumulating more land. And by 1775, we think he had over 5,000 acres. The guy was an interested and energetic man. Started really early. But from this point, South Carolina entered what I call the turbulent years. And they were very important for this state. We had the French and Indian War. We had the Cherokee Wars. And then we had the regulator movement. I don't know how many know about the regulator movement, but it wasn't a fun time for South Carolina. And this was very important for us because I did not find any direct evidence of Henry being involved in these wars. But the fact that he had already risen to prominence in the church and in the community, and right after this he would be appointed to a post, and he was good. He had an acquaintance with a man called William Danger Thompson. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of William Danger Thompson. William Danger Thompson was from Orangeburg, an acquaintance of Henry's, and obviously these two guys were associates. And William Danger Thompson was definitely involved in these activities, and maybe Henry was too. I just don't have any direct evidence of that. So, we had the Indian and French Wars, and during that time, we had major Revolutionary War leaders emerge. They learned how to be leaders. They learned how to use irregular warfare. They learned how to motivate men and women. And these are men such as William Moultrie, Andrew Pickens, Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion, and many more. We also saw the growth of the backcountry leadership, such as William Danger Thompson, I mentioned, and Henry Felder. Because in the backcountry, we had no laws that were being enforced. We had no courthouses. We had no jails. We had no judges. And that gave rise to the regulators of South Carolina. These were settlement leaders who stood and became what they call, let me see, the quote is, good order and harmony. You're not going to see that in some books because they also became overzealous enforcing the law. And that became a problem. So the royal governor decided he would appoint his guys to enforce the laws in the backcountry, and he called them moderators. So now we had the moderators over here and the regulators over here, and you know that they're going to meet each other sooner or later, and good things are not going to happen. And so it happened. They met on the banks of the Bush and the Saluda Rivers down near Columbia, 700 each, and we would have thought a conflict was about to happen. But William Danger Thompson and another Revolutionary War hero from the area, Richard Richardson, who became a general during the Revolutionary War, was able to negotiate a truce between these two groups. And once again, no conflict, no blood let. North Carolina, on the other hand, had regulators. Their royal governor immediately marshaled a bunch of troops and went out and hung them all, or chased them into the wilderness. We handled our problem differently, and I think that speaks a lot for us. Because soon after that, we finally passed the Circuit Court Act of 1769. The truth happened 2 years later or some months later, and together, immediately we started building courthouses. We set up courts. We set up circuit courts. We built jails in this state, in the backcountry. This is important because at that time also, the backcountry leaders that I mentioned are now known to the men and women in Charleston as men of trust, and that would help us quite a bit. And out of that, William Danger Thompson became the sheriff of the area, and Henry Felder became the magistrate of the area. And that's how I believe that he was involved in some way. I just can't tell you exactly what it was. But unfortunately, we know that the British in the Parliament had other acts to pass. Thank you very much. Had other acts to pass. And taxation against this young colony, we didn't have the money. And then we all know what happened with the Tea Act, that all of a sudden we had a few tea parties. Most of us learned in school about the Boston Tea Party, where Samuel Adams and a bunch of people dressed up as Indians and threw the cargo in the water. South Carolina had at least three tea parties, and North Carolina had one as well. We settled ours a little differently. I know the latter two did throw them in the cargo, but we won't talk about that. But the first one the one that took attention to the British people. We took it, we negotiated, and we took the cargo and put it in the basement of the old Exchange building in Charleston. It was an agreement between the two. They weren't supposed to send it here. They did. We took it and we said, we'll set it over here for you for later. But things were starting to change. So we had the Continental Congress said we've got to do something about this because British had intolerable acts against our country after that, mostly aimed at Boston. But we suffered from those as well. And the Continental Congress said we got to do something. So they did the Continental Association boycott, which no more British goods were coming or going in the colonies. And so they said we're going to enforce this starting in December. South Carolina, in turn, formed the first continental, or what they call the provincial government, the provincial Congress of South Carolina. They did three important things. First of all, they needed to implement the enforcement. And they selected 11 men in the back country, one of which was Henry Felder, to enforce and make sure there was no trade with British goods in the back country. The second thing they did was they took the district militias and tried to encourage them to stand up, which the Orangeburg District did. They had the Orangeburg District Militia was formed in February, and William Danger Thompson, name you'll keep hearing, became their commander. And then several months later in June, this Congress brought about the first regiments of South Carolina. The 3rd Regiment was a regiment of Rangers, and they selected William Thompson to lead them as well. And with that, one of their first acts was in July. In July, the South Carolina Rangers and the Orangeburg District Militia went to Fort Charlotte without violence and took that fort. They took that fort to have the gunpowder and the cannons and the weapons to help fight a war. Many of y'all know that Lexington and Concord happened the month before, where we needed to secure our gunpowder. And in Williamsburg, something similar happened when the governor of that state, of that colony, took the gunpowder and put it out on a ship, and the people in Virginia weren't happy about that. And we also know that it happened in Charleston, where overnight we had some people raid the magazines of the royal government and took the gunpowder, again without bloodshed. All of that happened within 3 days as if it was coordinated. It couldn't have been, but it seemed that way. But what happened next was important as we were turning to prepare for war. Henry stayed in Congress. Well, he was first elected to Congress. He wasn't in the first provincial, but he was in the second provincial Congress. And then things started accelerating on him. Whether it had to do with his expertise in gunpowder, his willingness, or just energetic, he was quickly appointed to do something about the gunpowder in this state. And the other big act he did was he was appointed the foreman of the grand jury, which was two important appointments that I want to talk about. In November, the gunpowder we took from Fort Charlotte was damaged, or it had clumped, or it was coarse. He was asked to grind it so it was usable for our patriots. Shortly after that, in March, he was asked with a few others to come up with a way for us to erect a powder mill to become self-sufficient and the making of gunpowder. I could talk a long time about that, but I won't. Because it was very interesting, because we did not have a lot of niter in this colony. And it's kind of interesting the ways that they did that. Then, a couple of days later, they said, we need ironworks. We need to produce iron here. And so he was called again to get with some fine gentlemen to come up with how do we erect an ironwork and how do we promote the colony to build an ironwork and start producing iron. And then right before that Congress ended, they asked him one last time. They said, now we want you to make the gunpowder. We have some niter, we have some sulfur, go make some gunpowder. And so he started making gunpowder. But he got busy again. As the grand jury foreman, we had just passed our first Constitution of South Carolina. It had some very strong words in it about a separate government. We had some prominent members who did not care for that language. They thought it was actually treasonous, and we had no business setting up our own government. We were actually the second colony to actually have our own constitution. We were getting going because we knew where this was heading, to be honest. But William Henry Drayton, that name again, was very involved as well. He was the Chief Justice of South Carolina, and he charged the Orangeburg grand jury to look at the words in that Constitution and determine whether or not they thought it was appropriate or legal. Now, given the fact that the Constitution had some soft words in it, even though it was separate, they had some soft words such as we were abandoned and we were forced to create a government. And we needed an independent government. And we also said it was temporary until such resolution of differences occurred. So it was kind of soft. And so they gave it to Henry and 11 other members of the grand jury. And they came back with something just a little bit stronger. They wrote, while engaged in an arduous and glorious struggle for the preservation of those invaluable rights and liberty which the law of reason and nature all men have a right to possess. And then later, it closed it with, we declare that as we most heartily approve, so that we're determined with our lives and fortune to support, maintain, and defend it, and to the end, we will with our utmost power. In a much longer document, there's a document back there that kind of shows a replica of what it would have looked like. Felder borrowed words from Thomas Paine and John Locke about laws of nature and nature laws. And we will all know those words because 2 months later, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin produced the Declaration of Independence. So the new government was forming. And there was a lot to follow during this same time as when we had the Battle of Sullivan's Island, Fort Sullivan, and the Battle of the Breach. And the fact that the Orangeburg District and Thomas's Rangers was at the breach fighting the British who were trying to cross over on those two islands, there's a good chance one of the Felders or more were probably there at that battle. And then the Second General Assembly was brought to bear. Once again, Henry's in the grand jury, and he would push for oath of allegiance, which Congress finally passed. If you did not take the oath, you were invited to leave. We paid for it, but you need to leave this state. Another big thing that happened during that is this state ratified our first constitution of this nation, the Articles of Confederation. But as things were progressing and accelerating, Henry couldn't stay in the government anymore. The war was starting to happen, and he and his 7 sons, Henry Jr., John, Jacob, Samuel, Frederick, and Peter, all joined the Orangeburg militia. And before they even left office, Henry left office, they had already burned his home, and he had already lost all of the monies that they had given him to do the task that he was supposed to do as far as clearing the North Fork of Edisto. He was also a collector and an inquirer of rice and flour that he would buy for the area in Orangeburg, and he lost all of that. But then the Southern campaign started. Now, the Southern campaign in South Carolina and the South Carolina militia, as I mentioned earlier, is something that's often overlooked. And it's overlooked or undertold, even though we had 500 events in South Carolina, even though we had well over 200 skirmishes that occurred in this state, even though 1/3 of the combat casualties, not the illnesses, but combat casualties, happen in this state. And between this state hosting and the militia that participated in the bloodiest battles of the Revolutionary War, the Siege of Savannah, Waxhaw, Stono Ferry, Camden, Kings Mountain, Hobcog Hill, and the last major battle here, Eutaw Springs, all within South Carolina or included the militia. And then Charleston fell in 1780, and the predominance of the war shifted to the South. Almost everything that happened at that point happened in the Southern campaign, with a few exceptions. Benedict Arnold, now a British general, attacked and invaded Virginia. He was a good commander, even if he did be a traitor, which we hold against him, of course. And the other thing was, of course, the battle at Yorktown. The siege at Yorktown happened after the Charleston. Excuse me. But we don't talk a lot about. It's not an exciting theme, the Southern campaign. If we had time, I would sit down and say, how many movies do you know that happened around the Revolutionary War, beyond the Patriot? And we would sit here a while, and we could probably come up with about 10 or 14, including miniseries. But it's just not a theme written about much. And so the question is why not? And there's a lot of theories. I talked to the gentleman in the back earlier, the theories of why we don't talk a lot about the Southern campaign in our history books, or we see films about it. And I think a lot of it has to do with these battles, and their leaders are not talked in the most favorable terms sometimes. And we see these often quotes come out talking about our battles or our leaders that we had here. And they weren't in really nice terms. I'm not going to talk. At the bottom you see just a couple of things that were said during times. And I would ask you, if you read books of the Revolutionary War and you see some of these terms, you should ask yourself a question. Who said it? When did he say it? And why did he say it? The context and the conditions when they made those comments are very, very important and should not be taken out of context or used just to be derogatory toward the militia in general. So the beliefs are that the militia usually fled. And I've studied this quite a bit, and the militia did flee in certain cases, mainly because they were raw, they didn't know what to do, and they were under commanders that they did not know. And the British had the bayonet charge, and a lot of these people didn't have bayonets. If they had rifles, they did not have bayonets because rifles don't fit a bayonet. And so they would flee. I never found a case where the South Carolina militia, though, fled. And if somebody finds one, I'd like to know it because I don't know where it occurred. They were said that they came and went as they desired and were unreliable. Well, some of our great generals always wanted a large army to go against the British. And I can tell you that was never going to happen. Not in South Carolina, it wasn't. And mostly not in the North. Washington never had enough men. He fought with Congress to have more men. It just was a truism. And we were not going to go head to head with the British with thousands of men anyway. That was not possible. But some people don't know that in the beginning, the militia could only enlist for 1 or 2 months. It was the law of the land of South Carolina that you couldn't serve more than that because they wanted you back on your farm to raise horses and crops and then come back, which they did. And as the war progressed, and the Felders I've studied, they would come back time and time and time again, and their length of service was probably longer than most Continental Army soldiers. They were neither professional nor disciplined. True to people that they did not know, but they were recruited by men that they knew out of their districts. They didn't force the haircuts. They didn't force you to wear a nice suit. And this is where, if we want to talk about Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter, this is where these two gentlemen are really, really different. Francis Marion was a disciplinarian. His mentor was William Moultrie. Thomas Sumter came from the woods with the Indians, and he felt he was a peer on all of his men, and he could motivate the heck up, but he didn't care what they looked like. Never dependable in battle, and they were inconsequential. Well, this is true because of the commanders were not endearing themselves, as I mentioned, and as I mentioned, a lot of these men had rifles. They were not deployed properly. Muskets and rifles need an entirely different tactical deployment, an entirely different strategy to use them. And we know this because the Battle of Saratoga, Daniel Morgan used the riflemen perfect. And in Cowpens, Daniel Morgan again used the riflemen perfectly. And Thomas Sumter did at the battle at Blackstocks, not too far from here, and a couple other battles. At the Battle of the Breach, when they were trying to cross the water, a musket wouldn't have hit those men coming across that water. It was the Rangers with their rifle picking off the British. We could pick off people at about 300 yards with a rifle. It just took 3 times longer to load it. A musket is sort of accurate around 60, and you could probably hit part of a body. But because they shot them in a row, it's kind of like a shotgun shot coming down, so you're going to hit the enemy. And so, you know, we have those things, but there was reasons why the militia endured and they were successful. That was different than the other states. That is, in South Carolina, the backcountry was only first or second generation. Some of the other colonies had been there a lot longer. These men either knew firsthand or their parents knew firsthand the tyranny over in Europe and why they came here and were willing to fight for it. And so they hadn't forgotten. I mentioned to you the early activities and the hardships that they suffered through that kind of emboldened them and knew that there was something more important than self for this colony. The early engagements built convictions between them and the backcountry to fight on. I mentioned the experience and the trusted leadership with leaders that they knew made a lot of difference. But one of the things that's fascinating that people kind of read through is in war, this militia seldom left the state. In early days, they went to Georgia all the way to Florida, the banks of Florida, and we're at the siege of Savannah, excuse me. But after that, they were in this state. They were fighting on home turf. And when you're fighting on home turf, if you're a football person, you fight harder. But we also fought with a special knowledge. That special knowledge is the fact, excuse me again, that special knowledge is that South Carolina has a unique terrain, geography, rivers and swamp, ferry crossings. We knew how to fight like the Indians, and we knew the proper deployment of rifles. The other colonies, you're not going to find that. Not all of those things. You maybe see parts of it, but you're not going to see that. And you saw that at Blackstock and Cowpens and places like that. General Marion and General Sumter knew this and knew how to employ this. And they took advantage of their knowledge of the land and the swamp and the crossing and where to forage. If you don't know the sentiment of a settlement, you don't know who your good guy and the bad guys are, and you don't know who could give you crops. Or like I mentioned my ancestor Eleazar, you wouldn't know where he was and where to get forage for your horses or a wagon or whatever it is you might need in that area. It was loyalist. You couldn't go knock on doors. That wasn't going to happen. And if you didn't know that, General Gates came down here and marched to Camden. He didn't want any of our militia. He didn't want Sumter. He didn't want Marion. He deployed them on either side of Camden and marched through the heat. Didn't know where to get the food. Didn't know where to get the supplies. And all I can say is if you don't know this special knowledge and where you are and what you're doing, bad things are going to happen. Now, there's many aspects of this war that can be debated. The merits, how and why we won, and with our automobile tags that I've seen. We got new automobile tags, and it says where the Revolutionary War was won. I don't know what they were thinking or what they used to support that thesis. Maybe somebody here knows, but I don't. I'm not going to disagree with it because I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to give you my opinion. I'm going to give you the opinion of this man here. This is Edmund Burke out of Parliament, a well-known guy, historian, and he wrote this right after some of our skirmishes and battles. And I believe him. He said, most of these actions would, in other words, be considered skirmishes of little account, scarcely worthy of a detailed narrative. But these small actions are as capable of displaying military conduct and operational war being spread across this vast continent by the new plan that was adopted. It is such skirmishes that the fate of America must be necessarily decided, and therefore as important as battles in which 100,000 are drawn up on each side. That's what was written over there on that placard. I mean, he gets it. I mean, some people will say, you just had a bunch of skirmishes here, you used slingshots or whatever, but it was much, much more than that. The whole war was decided here, and the tag I agree with. And in two other revealing assessments, Edward McGrady wrote in 1902 about the battle that I believe is mischaracterized and misrepresented that happened at Quimby Bridge and Schubert's Plantation. I've studied this in-depthly. McGrady said the British interest was materially shaken that day, and the party alarmed and humbled, and the spirit of the Whigs, the South Carolina militia, raised, and the fact was announced to the world that this country was not conquered. And then later, William Johnson, who wrote the sketches of Nathaniel Greene in 1822, he said that perhaps the greatest benefit that resulted from this expedition was the confidence in which it inspired the militia themselves. The party actually engaged and attacked the British Colonel Coates were almost exclusively the South Carolina militia. And that was the blunt of the British Army at that time they were going against. And the bravery that they displayed would have done honor to any veteran troops. It demonstrated that this species of force, wanting nothing but the consistency to enable it to meet the enemy with effects. Their terror of the British bayonet and the British discipline diminished, whilst the respect of the enemy for their undisciplined valor rose proportionally. Now, I will add that our militia and patriots purchased our liberty. Henry Felder was known by the British and the Loyalists in the colony. He ultimately, a newly commissioned Loyalist, made it his quest to hunt down and kill Captain Henry Felder. In the end, the Loyalists found and killed him, but not before Henry took several Loyalists with him. Shortly thereafter, his son, John Felder, was killed supporting William Washington. But his remaining sons, like my ancestor Frederick Felder, fought from the Battle of the Savannah early in the war to Eutaw Springs. And like many South Carolinians, the Carolina militia and Henry Felder and his sons did not seek recognition. They had much earlier adopted this country and were more than willing to give it their all. And from the film, All for Liberty, and if you didn't know, All for Liberty is a film that you can watch. There's a pamphlet over there from Actors Theater. If you can go to their website, you can watch it for free or stream it. It's sometimes on Netflix as well. But from that film, John Rutledge said the following. He said, "It was then I began to think. It was people such as these, the ones you've never heard of, the names you never know, the statues, to honor them. No monuments, but without them, where would we be?" I could only talk of liberty. They were willing to die for it. So I thank you for your time. And if y'all have any questions, I'll be happy to take questions.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Is it Dr. Eleazar?
No, not
No. Well, I had a couple of degrees there.
just me.
Okay. So, questions about Henry Felder, questions about the war. We'll come right over here and
my question concerns the slides. the paintings on the slides were magnificent. Where did those come from?
That's a very good question. And the truth is, I made them all. I started when I was doing my book, I could not find good paintings. And the ones I could find, I reached out to the painters or the people who owned the paintings. And I couldn't get much responsiveness. So I started with AI. And it's got to be careful with this, by the way, folks. I was an IT guy, software engineer, developer. And I used a very powerful AI tool that I don't know is available to everyone. But anytime you use AI, guys, women, whoever, you need to know some of the subject matter you're talking about, because what this thing will do is it will give you Apache helicopters in the background. Or it said things about Thomas Sumter that was absolutely patently not true. So you really need to know what you're doing and having some kind of idea when you use AI. Before you take whatever they say about a medical appointment as gospel, please, check yourself and know what you're doing. But anyway, it was AI, sir. And my publisher, even though I owned all the rights, they were still leery of me using AI. So you'll see there's no AI in my book. But for the slides, I wanted to tell a story. And even if I bored you or had bad words up here, I was hoping that you would catch that they're nice slides. Any other question?
I went to college in Massachusetts. Of course, they're very proud of the Sons of Liberty. Was there such a group in South Carolina?
Great question. What was occurring, and I'm proud of this point too, so thanks for setting me up. We did have the Sons of Liberty. There were several Sons of Liberty up and down the colony, and actually that was one of the better networks for communicating because they were way ahead of this curve in what they needed to do. Samuel Adams, Fire and Brimstone, he was almost best bud with Christopher Gaston. When Christopher Gaston of South Carolina went to the first Congress up there, they wanted to meet each other because they knew a little bit about where they were coming from. So we did. And if you're ever in Charleston, I'm trying to think of the street name. I think it's Alexander Street. There's a plaque for them where the Liberty Tree was of South Carolina. If you know where Saffron's restaurant is on Bay, you're very close to it. And John Calvert was an original Liberty boy for Gadsden. He had become a lieutenant. He was in a couple of battles before he was injured, and actually I'm related to him on another side. He's buried in Columbia.
Okay, other questions? See, when you ask these questions, we get into all kinds of side things that are fascinating that you wouldn't have known about otherwise. Questions?
Well, if any of y'all have questions later, please let me know. Take my card. This is my passion, drives my wife. I didn't think my wife. She puts up with all of this.
There is a question here in the back.
So Clarence Felder is the one who's going to play him this summer. And was he a sixth great-great-great-grandchild also of Henry?
I believe so. I am very good friends with Clarence. He portrays it wonderfully. He's the one who portrayed it in the movie. A dear friend. So is his wife, Chris Weatherhead Felder. And he was a descendant of Abraham, as this lady here was, who was another one of the brothers. And if you're interested, if you have Felder, I know this won't be my final version of this map over here, but I put together a timeline and I put where the Felders were active in the middle. You'll also see how much the Southern campaign started up when the Northern campaign was kind of winding down, because the British turned what they called the Southern strategy. And so they wanted to create a civil war in South Carolina to get the Loyalists to fight the Patriots, Whigs versus Tories. It didn't materialize, but it was very bloody and brutal. And I probably glossed over this, as I mentioned. In the beginning of the war, the backcountry, most of them did not have a quarrel with the British. Henry was unique. He did early. I don't know what stirred him up, but something did, because he was just out there. But some were reluctant. But when the Civil War aspect that Walter Edgar mentioned in the Ken Burns film, when that started up, all they did was all the people who were still on the fence and didn't want to engage, knocked them off. Because even they said, this isn't what we want here. And we had more militia at that point, or sympathizers who supplied our men. And the whole thing kind of changed. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Yes. Over there.
Over here?
We've got one over on. Yeah. Hold up your hand, sir. She'll bring you a
Over here.
microphone.
You talked about them needing to take the oath of loyalty in the colony. Where did the people go that didn't take the oath if they had to get out of South Carolina?
A lot of them went to Florida, just like our prisoners when Charleston collapsed. They took the most radical ones like Gadsden that I mentioned, and they shipped them off to the prison in St. Augustine. If you ever visit there and see the prison, if you go to the most dreary without window opening there, that's where they put Gadsden. He was a scary guy to them. But a lot of them went to Florida. Some of them were able to get a senior prominent person in Charleston to vouch for them and said, we really need them here. Like Dr. Garden. I don't know how many of y'all know who Dr. Garden is. He's the one that was named, the gardenia was named for him. He was vouched for, but he wouldn't stop writing letters to Cornwallis and stuff, and he was eventually told, you know, you need to leave. But some people vouched and stayed.
I'll just throw in that here in locally, we had Richard Paris, the founder of our city down at the falls and all that, who managed to steal hundreds of acres in a really clever scheme. He was very much a loyalist. And when the war was over, he understood he was not welcomed back in Greenville, and he went to Florida and then ended up establishing, I believe it was in Bermuda, estates there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that was another controversy that people said we don't want to make people take an oath. And Henry was still on the grand jury, and they wrote a decision on it, sent it over to Congress and said, Congress, you need to pass this. And they did. I'd read things that when he spoke, before he sat down, it would be passed. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it sounds nice. I almost wish we had some people like that today, but I don't want to go off in that way.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I do want to mention, before I remind you to put your phones back off of airplane mode, that you don't have to travel all the way down to the Greer History Museum to find his books, because he has some copies of his books over here if you would like to read more about Captain Henry Felder and the campaigns in the South. That's available as well. And there are books to check out in the back and all that information. So thank you all very much. I do have one question I want to ask, a quickie survey, if you don't mind. We've thought about next year and how during the winter it gets dark really early, and our audiences sometimes drop lower because it's so dark so early. And we were thinking about maybe experimenting and having some of our talks, the Tuesday talks during the winter, maybe on a Sunday afternoon, like 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon here. How many of you would find that a desirable thing for us to do during the winter? Oh, a lot of hands. Okay, cool. We're in the planning stage when working with the library and everything, but that's a possibility that in the winter months when it gets dark so early, we might be able to be in the light over here. Okay. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
John, Brian, Eliezer.
Thank you.